Hey everybody, welcome back to the Full Armor of God podcast. I'm your host, Father Deacon Don Purdum. This last week has been a little bit on the crazy side. I haven't gotten as much done for you guys as I hoped to in terms of my regular writing. We've had some issues around here with Comcast upgrading their lines to improve our service, which, personally, I haven't had a problem with it. But the point is that it's been down. And with it being down, it's been a little bit more challenging and harder to focus on creating content because obviously I need the internet. And it allowed me to do some deeper study and focus on some other things in my own life as well as some stuff in my business life. Well, anyway, last week we got into a lesson talking about salvation in the context first of understanding sin. And we established that there were 7 words for sin, but we focused in on 3 of them in particular. Hata, which is more of a generic term, meaning erring, doing wrong, missing the mark, going astray, that kind of context, just this general word for sin. And then we focused on pasa. Now, I'm clearly not going to be pronunciating these correctly since I'm not Hebrew and I don't speak the Hebrew language. But with that said, pasa means a willful rebellion against God or a break with God. It's this defiant, intentional act of choosing to do something that I know is offensive to God. And it's going out of my way to make a point or to be offensive in some regards. And the third word was awan. And this word is perversity, depravity, or guilt. So let's think about these 3 words again. Hata, general word when you see in the Old Testament, translated as sin. Pasa, a willful break, a rebellion from God. That word is usually translated as transgression into the English in the Old Testament. And the third, awan, perversity, depravity, or guilt, is translated as inequity. And we saw all 3 of these words going in interplay back and forth last week in Psalm 51, and there's a whole context for that. You can go back and listen to that message. Today, I want to focus on the context of understanding salvation in Torah. Now, Torah in many instances is usually the 5 books of the Old Testament. It's the law of God. There are other ways that the Jewish people use the word Torah throughout history, and it gets kind of more established into the Talmud. I'm actually going to do an article on that tomorrow and talk more about that on the website. But with that said, let's go back and remember in Numbers 15 from our study last week, it talked about for the unintentional sin. This is Numbers 15, 29 and 30. For the unintentional sin, the people are to be cut off and removed from the land. There is no forgiveness for somebody who acts defiantly. Again, there's pasa, right? This is a very significant word. It's a very significant meaning, and we're going to get into today's study talking about intentionality more. So let's look and zoom in for a few minutes on Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. These 3 books of the Old Testament that make up Torah, the law of God, the law of Moses, these are the foundation for the rest of Israel's history and for that of the church as well. And hopefully this is going to make some sense as we kind of wind through this study of salvation as we work next week towards Judges and then towards the divided kingdom of Israel and Judah and how God deals with them, the 70 years of captivity, the quietness of the prophets until Micah, and then 500 years of silence leading up to Jesus coming from heaven to earth as fully God and fully man. And you know the rest of that story, at least I hope. We're going to get into that if not. So with that said, let's look at, big picture. These 3 books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, they are this foundation. Leviticus is about the holiness of God. And there's a reason for that, because it's dealing with the Levite priest. And if you're going to be a priest for God, then it's important that you're completely consecrated in his holiness. And to be holy is to be without sin. And that is what holiness is. Holiness is the absence of sin. Righteousness is the right behavior that comes from holiness. So it's to not act in sin, but to act in holiness. That's what righteousness is. So Leviticus is about the holiness of God and the requirements for having a relationship with this holy God. Now, you can't begin to understand holiness if you don't understand sin, because sin is the contrast. It's the opposite of holiness. And so, in revealing sin, Leviticus also provides the atonement for sinful humans to have a relationship with God, to have access to God. Now, Numbers is really men's lesson in walking by faith and trusting God's promises. Some of the highlights in the book of Numbers, because again, there's a lot of mundaneness in here, so I'm just kind of giving you the highlights, is that you had a lot of unbelief and discontent of the people. And there's a reason for that. They're now wandering in the desert. Moses has delivered them from Egypt. Well, God has delivered them through Moses from Egypt. They have fled. They have seen the Red Sea part. They have gone through the Red Sea. Now they are in the desert for some time, and they're beginning to grumble. They're beginning to say to themselves, we would have been better off in slavery. Now, you and I know that's not true, but in the human condition, we think so temporally that sometimes, you see God do some of the greatest things. And in those great things, it's easy to remember when suddenly you're feeling destitute, you're feeling alone, you feel like everything is going against you, and you begin to question, okay, God, you brought me out of this. Where are we going? Why are these horrible things now happening? And then that will lead to rebellion in the book of Numbers from Moses' leadership, and by rebelling from Moses, also rebelling from God. Well, in this rebellion, there's also a refusal to enter the promised land, the whole purpose for them going. And then you have Moses' failures throughout the book. Moses has many failures, folks. He was human. One time when he comes down from Mount Sinai, right, he observes the people in idolatrous worship. He cracks not the templates, excuse me, folks. He cracks and breaks the stone writings of God. He breaks them in his moment of anger over their idolatrous worship. And yet, despite all of this, God still supported them, even though they rebelled from him. He still provided for them. He still made the way. That's the story of the book of Numbers. Deuteronomy. It's important to understand that the word Deuteronomy, deut, means second, right? It's the second giving of the law by Moses. So in Deuteronomy, we have the Ten Commandments. We have the great Shema in Deuteronomy 6:4-9. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one. And we also, for the first time, really get this perspective of how significant of a problem false prophets and diviners were. And there are warnings in Deuteronomy, significant warnings given about false prophets and diviners. So those are our three overview books, our overview of the three books of Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. Okay, so let's turn to the sacrifices now, because the sacrifices are the means for people to have a relationship with Yahweh, with God, with Elohim. There's all these wonderful names of God: Elohim, Adonai, Yahweh. There are many, many more. Nonetheless, the point is that the sacrifices are this means to deal with our sin so that we could have a relationship with God if we lived in the Old Testament. And now what I'm going to present to you is a very broad outline here. But I want you to note, if you go and you read these three books, or especially in Leviticus, really Leviticus 1 Leviticus chapters 1 through 5, Leviticus chapters 1 through 5 deal significantly with the sacrificial system. And I want you to note, if you read them, how extremely particular they are in terms of the process and the cost. Sin wasn't cheap. If you were an Old Testament saint, if you were going to have a relationship with God, if you were going to follow God, if you're going to walk with God, it was going to cost you something significant. We will see that today. So, let's jump into the first sacrifice. Now, it's not going to be in Leviticus, and this is why I want you to see God's salvation in Torah, that what God's ultimate perspective always was. In Genesis 3:21, we have the account of the fall of Adam and Eve. And we see in there that after they eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, that Adam and Eve begin to, they realize rather quickly that they are not clothed and that they feel ashamed. And so what do? They gather themselves up fig leaves to clothe themselves, to cover themselves from one another, as if they didn't already know what they look like without clothes on, because they hadn't been wearing clothes all of this long time in the Garden of Eden. Nonetheless, they put on the fig leaves, and then God comes looking for them. And when he finds them with these fig leaves on. So what does God do? God decides that they need much more suitable clothing than what they have on. And he sacrifices an animal to provide them with clothing. Now, I don't know how you would look at this, but the way that I look at this is that this is an act of love and care in the immediate aftermath of their disobedience. God immediately sacrifices an animal and uses the skin from the animal to make for them clothes. This is profound. This is the very first act of sacrifice, and it's done by God for Adam and Eve. And if we think about this, up to the flood and even beyond the flood, we see that there are sacrifices given by people who don't worship Yahweh, that don't worship Elohim, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. So where did this come from? Because we don't have an account of it anywhere else in the New Testament, in these early books of in these early chapters of Genesis. But we see that even in Moses' time, that there are Canaanites and Moabites, and there are all these people making sacrifices to false gods. I think they got this from, and this is speaking from silence, but where else would they have gotten it from? They've got it from Genesis 3:21. I think that Adam and Eve continued making a sacrifice to God. We know in Job, which might actually be one of the earliest books written, even before Moses wrote Genesis, that there were sacrifices going on. Where did they get this from without Moses's directions for sacrifices? Where did they get the idea to give a sacrifice to a false god? I think they got it from Genesis 3:21. Adam and Eve must have continued doing this, and as the population grew, these ideas kind of went along with them to give sacrifices to false gods. Then in Genesis 8:20-21, we also see after the flood, Noah offers a sacrifice. This is the second sacrifice we see in the Old Testament. Before we get to Leviticus, let's turn to Leviticus now. Again, we know there were many sacrifices going on before this, but now we are given a context for how to properly give a sacrifice. And in Leviticus chapters 1-5, we see 5 different types of sacrifices. But what I want you to note is, out of those 5, 3 of them were voluntary. And they're voluntary for a reason, because God wants people's heart. He wants them to be in a relationship with them because they want to be in a relationship with him. So let's look at these 5 sacrifices, and we're going to start with the 3 that are not mandatory. They are voluntary. The first is the burnt offering. All right, this is in Leviticus chapter 1. The burnt offering is really, its purpose is to express thanks or to worship. It's devotion and commitment to God. It also is an atonement for unintentional sin. So let's look at what atonement is for a second. Atonement comes from the Hebrew word kippur. The idea here is that sin is transferred from the animal whose death reconciles the gap between the offender, which is the human, and the offended, who is God. Atonement repays a debt, and it purifies, or it covers, reconciles, or appeases. That's a lot. See, these words have a lot more meaning than how we generically think about them. So a burnt offering, and it gives atonement. Atonement is not just a transfer of a sin, but it's to repay a debt and purify the person offering the sacrifice, to cover their sin, to reconcile their sin, or to appease their sin. Okay? The second one is a grain offering. This one expresses gratitude. This is in now chapter 2, Leviticus 2. It expresses gratitude and thanksgiving, recognizing the Lord's favor. It is unmerited goodwill and a provision towards the person making the sacrifice. That's its purpose, to express gratitude and thanksgiving. The third is a peace offering. Now, this one is a little different than the other 2. The peace offering involves the best and unblemished animal from the herd, as well as the best grains and bread offerings. So, think about that for a minute. Remember I said that sin cost you something? If you're going to offer a peace offering, then it's an unblemished animal. In other words, this animal is not without defect, but it's also the most valued amongst the person's flock. Or the grain is the best of the grains from their provisions, from their farmland. And so it cost them something. And every time you offer a peace offering, it is significant. So a peace offering also expresses thanks, but it emphasizes fellowship, and it's always followed by a meal. The priest also received part of this sacrifice as food. Now keep in mind that the Levitical priest, they did not have any other work to do. They were set apart by God. The Levites were set apart from God for this one purpose: to commune with him and to provide the means for sacrifice so that the nation could be in a relationship with him. These are the priests. They're not to do anything else. So if they're going to eat, it's going to come from the other 11 tribes. That's important. There are 12 tribes. One of them doesn't work. The other 11 do. The other 11, through the peace offering, ensures that the priest have a means for food. Let's get into the other 2 now, because these are not inconsequential sacrifices. In Leviticus 4 now, we have the sin offering. The word sin is teheta. It is the plural of hata. Remember what we said earlier about there are 7 different words for sin? Well, this one is a sin offering for every sin that you could think of. But there's a catch. In verse 2, here we have this word unintentional. We saw this last week in our study when we came across Numbers 15. For the unintentional sin you shall, for the unintentional sin you shall. Here we are again. In the sin offering, we have the unintentional sin. And it's mentioned 3 times in Leviticus 4, in verse 2, verse 22, and verse 27. What is the meaning of this word unintentional? This is important. I hope you stayed with me this long, because this framework is vital to understanding the sacrificial system, and it's vitally important to understanding this new and greater covenant we've received in Christ, which we will get into at a later date. But the point here is unintentional. This word suggests a lack of deep understanding of the seriousness of hata, of sin. In other words, the person didn't know any better. There's another point to make about unintentional sin. It could involve a degree of consciousness and awareness that something was done willingly, but it was done out of weakness, not deliberative premeditation, not out of rebellion in the sense that pasa is committed. Remember, pasa is a deliberate rebellion, a deliberate break from God. In this case, it's something done willingly out of weakness. The sin offering, this one and the next one, are mandatory. See, it atoned, it purified, reconciled, or appeased for sins and cleansed one from defilement. The other ones didn't do that. This one does. This one cleanses a person, a sinner, from defilement. We also will see later the Day of Atonement, when the high priest will go into the Holy of Holies in either the tabernacle or the temple, and will offer a sacrifice of atonement for the entire nation, not just for an individual. It cleanses them from defilement. And then fifth, the guilt offering. Now, the idea of the guilt offering is slightly different from the sin offering. It deals with restitution for those who committed, again, an unintentional sin, mentioned 3 times. That would be in Leviticus 5, verses 15, 17, and 18. So what was the purpose of all of this? There is a purpose. First, we have to get the idea out of our mind that the purpose of the sacrificial system was to appease God's wrath. That's not what it was at all. Now, if you were a pagan in the culture surrounding Israel, yeah, that's why you offered a sacrifice, is to appease some kind of God's wrath. There's a drought, so God must be angry. There's too much rain, God must be angry. There's a storm coming, there's rain, God must be angry. Whatever the case may be, the response of a pagan towards and their idolatrous worship of a false god was to appease them and to beg and plead with them for something good to happen. That is not what's happening here. You're not appeasing God's wrath. Instead, sacrifices reminded people that breaking their covenant with God was sin, and it was consequential, it was serious, and inevitably it led to pain, suffering, and death. That's what sin does. Doesn't Romans 6:23 remind us of that? And Romans 3:23 remind us of that? The wages of sin are death. These sacrifices reminded people that breaking their covenant relationship with God led to pain, suffering, and death. When they were in a right relationship with God, He protected them. We're going to see why this is so important when we get into the book of Judges next week. I want us to think for a minute, though, about this covenant with God. Now, God made a couple of covenants with His people, but the initial covenant, the most profound covenant, was the Abrahamic covenant, and that was given in Genesis 15:8-21. And if we go back there and look in Genesis 15:8-21, what we saw was Abraham was instructed to take an animal and cut it in half, and then to place them on opposite sides, those halves on opposite sides from one another. In the ancient world, this is how you created a covenant. And so there were multiple different types of animals that were offered, cut in half, and it's interesting. I mean, this whole idea of how covenants were created by these cutting an animal in half. I just don't know what else to say about it. But anyway, after it was done and they were laid out apart from each other, the parties, both parties in the ancient world entering into a covenant would walk between the two halves after exchanging vows. And the vow invariably said something like this: if I break my covenant vow, let it be to me as to this or these animals. That's how serious this was. If I break my covenant with the other party, then I'm to end up as this animal, cut in half, dead. That's how serious a covenant was. This is why the scriptures warn us that if you make a covenant, you better take it seriously. Otherwise, don't swear, because swearing is a form of a covenant. I swear I will do this. But instead, let your yes be yes and your no be no. Otherwise, you fall under this covenant. And then the consequence is steep if you break it. But what I want you to notice if you go to Genesis 15 is look at verse 18. Remember I said that a covenant was always established by two parties. In this case, we only have one because God put Abram to sleep. And he is the only one who goes between the animal parts. It's a one-sided covenant. There is no condition placed on Abraham. The condition was placed on God. The Abrahamic covenant was an act of salvation. Are we beginning to see this yet? All of these acts of salvation in the very beginning of Genesis 3, in the giving of Leviticus, in the 5 sacrifices, is a means for salvation. In Genesis 15, the Abrahamic covenant, another means, a covenant promise of salvation. Folks, sacrifices were meant to demonstrate the people's act of love in pursuing a relationship with God. He did his part. Now he's asking the people, in your act of love towards me, do your part. He recognizes that they weren't perfect. He recognized that they were sinful. He recognized that they will unintentionally do things that lead them to not be in a relationship with him, because holiness cannot be in the presence of sin. This was all about pursuing a relationship with God. But note, it only covered unintentional sin. It did not cover the defiant, rebellious, purposeful, thought out, I knew it was wrong, I did it anyway, I broke with God, and I rebelled sin. So here's the point. Sin leads to death for this reason. If there is not an act of contrition, if there's not an act of love on the part of the people, can they walk with God? Can they be with God? And I want you to think about this for a minute. If we are not with God, who are we with? This is a profound question. This is a significant question. If we are not walking with God, if we are not with God, if we are not choosing to give ourselves to God every day, who are we with? Because for them, they were outside of the covenant if they did that. And being outside of the covenant meant that they were enslaved to Satan, the destroyer. Now, I'm opening my Bible right now because I'm going to turn to 1 John chapter 3. And in verses 4 to 12, we have something significant that happens here. And I'm going to read this for you because I want you to understand the New Testament context for this, because it was just as true for us as it was for them in the Old Testament. This is something that never changed. 1 John chapter 3, verse 4. Everyone who practices sin also practices lawlessness, and sin is lawlessness. You know that he, Jesus, appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in Jesus sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. Little children, Now, I just want to stop for a second and say, when you see this phrase John uses, little children, he's basically saying you haven't contemplated on this. You're like a child whose impulses control you, not your knowledge and not your love of Christ. Little children, make sure no one deceives you. See, the lack of knowledge. Make sure no one deceives you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he, Jesus, is righteous. Remember what I said earlier about righteousness. Holiness is to be without sin. Righteousness is the behavior that comes out of holiness. It's right behavior. It has no sin. Okay? Make sure no one deceives you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. The one who practices sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. No one who is born of God practices sin, because his seed abides in him, and he cannot sin because he's born of God. By this, the children of God and the children of the devil are obvious. Anyone who does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor the one who does not love his brother. For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. There's Leviticus 19. Remember, we talked about this recently too, that Leviticus 19 says you should love your neighbor as yourself. And Jesus tells the Pharisee who questions him about what is the great commandment that, Jesus responds, you got this one right. Jesus says, you got that one right, Mr. Pharisee, that the great commandment is to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And Jesus says, but I tell you, the second great commandment is to love your neighbor as yourself. Jesus will pick up that illustration over and over to say, deny yourself, pick up your cross, follow me. Deny yourself, right? Love me, not yourself. That the Bible Jesus reminds us that there is no greater sacrifice, no greater love than one would give up his own life for another. And then we're reminded from the Apostle Paul that we are to carry each other's burdens. We are to love our brothers and our sisters. For this is the message which you have heard from the beginning, that we should love one another. Not as Cain, who was of the evil one, and slain his brother. And for this reason he did slay him, because his deeds were evil, and his brothers were righteous. Folks, if we aren't with God, we are with his adversary, Satan, the devil, the destroyer. I'm going to leave that with you today. I want you to ponder that. I want you to think about that for a little bit, because there's a lot of us out there as Christians who will go about our lives every day, and we don't think twice about our behavior or what we do. We go to church, we absolve ourselves emotionally, but we don't absolve ourselves before God. Those who follow Christ, those who are his disciples, those who love him, we don't go out of our way to rebel from him. We don't go out of our way to sin from him. We don't go out of our way to give in to the desires of our lust. And yet, he still loves us. It's an amazing message that we're going to see when we get into the New Testament about salvation. But I want you to go back and remember that for those who purposely, defiantly, rebelliously sinned in the Old Testament, those people were cut off from the land. They were removed. Numbers 15, 29 and 30. There was no forgiveness for them. If we are outside of the covenant, and if we are outside of the new covenant, the old covenant for the Jewish people before the new covenant and after the new covenant, if we are outside of it, then we are enslaved to Satan, the destroyer. I just want you to chew on that. I want you to think about that. I want you to pray about that. All right, folks. Thank you so much for listening in again today. God bless you. I'll be back on Tuesday with another podcast. And what will we talk about? Well, stay tuned. I think this one is one you're going to want to listen to. Until then, God bless you. Have a great week.